The massive Saturn V rocket, destined to carry the crew of Apollo 17 to the Moon, inched its way to the launch pad as final preparations were underway for the last lunar flight of the Apollo program. Each of the 5 successful moon landings before Apollo 17 had been crewed by test pilot astronauts, all of whom had some scientific training. But Apollo 17 would be the final chance for a fully trained scientist to set foot on the lunar surface. Apollo 17 is a story of humanity's desire to understand its place in the universe. For the first time, this account presents the recollections of that historic mission as told by all 3 crew members, together with their reflections on the future of humankind and our continuing exploration of space. Shifting political priorities. Once we had gone to the Moon and returned safely, the political center of mass began to shift, one astronaut recalled. Within the next administration and the new Congress, our focus began moving away from the Cold War and toward other issues, like getting out of Vietnam, which was a major concern at the time. None of the Apollo astronauts initially believed that the hard-won capabilities, everything NASA had developed to achieve a successful lunar landing, would be abandoned as rapidly as they were. In fact, up to Apollo 20 had been planned. There was hardware ready, and personnel had been laying down the groundwork for future missions. Yet, as Apollo progressed, NASA leadership recognized it needed to divide its efforts between completing the lunar program and building toward new objectives in the solar system. Indeed, by the time Apollo 15 was in training, Apollo 18 had already been cancelled. From an astronaut's perspective, the writing was on the wall. Apollo 15, 16 and 17 would be the final scientific forays on the Moon for the foreseeable future. Although it was disappointing to many in the science community, managers tried to find a compromise between continuing Apollo and pursuing other missions elsewhere. While some lamented the cancellation of Apollos 18, 19 and 20, NASA simply did not have the resources, budgetary or political, to carry them out. A scientist on the Moon, Jack Schmidt's place on Apollo 17 stemmed from pressure on NASA to ensure that the United States did not conclude the Apollo program without sending a professional scientist to the lunar surface. Schmidt's geological expertise was perfectly suited to the challenging landscape of the Taurus-Littrow Valley, where Apollo 17 would land. He admitted that it would test his own capabilities and those of any astronaut. "We hope," Schmidt said, "that geologically speaking we'll uncover rock types and other geologic evidence stretching back to the Moon's earliest history. That might help us better understand Earth, its evolution, and perhaps even predict what might happen here in the future." Others in NASA agreed. Gene Cernan, the Apollo 17 commander, later commended the decision to put Schmidt on the mission, even though it required removing another astronaut who had been slated for that seat. Cernan felt it epitomized what space exploration ought to be, sending scientists who could make the most of every moment on the lunar surface. Schmidt, for his part, said he had no regrets. He joined Apollo precisely to do vital work for both the United States and science, and being chosen for Apollo 17 let him show what a trained geologist could accomplish in space. Countdown and night launch. When launch day arrived, the Saturn V, taller than a 36-story building, stood ready, containing over 4.5 million pounds of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen propellants. The astronauts climbed aboard and strapped in, aware that launch was the one time they had almost no control. They simply had to trust the rocket. As the countdown progressed, heart rates soared, often higher than at any point in the mission, even more so than during lunar landings, because during launch the crew could only sit there. At T-minus 30 seconds, there was a sudden cut-off. Mission Control discovered a wiring issue with the launch computer. One of the oxygen tanks hadn't pressurized in response to the command from the ground. A technician manually pressurized it, and once resolved, they resumed the countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, ignition sequence start, 2, 1, liftoff. Night turned momentarily to day as the rocket's engines illuminated the launch pad and surrounding area. Looking out the window, the crew saw the sky light up with a reflection of intense orange. Then came the rumble, shock waves that rattled the cockpit and hammered everyone on the ground. 2 minutes and 10 seconds into flight, the first stage dropped away, leaving the second stage to ignite. Above most of the atmosphere, the ride smoothed out. After reaching Earth orbit, Mission Control called, "Your go for TLI, go for the Moon," meaning the SIVB third stage would light again to boost the spacecraft from 18,000 miles per hour to 25,000 miles per hour, sending Apollo 17 on a perfect trajectory. Coasting to the Moon, the view of Earth quickly changed from a curved horizon to a shrinking blue sphere. The crew retrieved the lunar module, LM, from its storage bay at the end of the Saturn V's third stage, docking flawlessly. Compared to earlier Apollo missions, Apollo 17 had very few issues. Their biggest problem, they joked, was Ron Evans temporarily losing his scissors, which were vital for cutting open food packets. Evans was also the deepest sleeper among them. When Cernan and Schmidt tried to wake him on the third night, he slept so soundly that even the master alarm didn't stir him, forcing them to shake him awake. Aside from these minor incidents, the spacecraft remained on a perfect course toward a rendezvous with the Moon, which at that phase was not illuminated in their landing region, effectively a new moon from Earth's perspective. Yet ground controllers assured them they'd miss the Moon's surface by the 50 miles necessary for orbital capture, lunar orbit and descent. After approximately 3 days, Apollo 17 slipped behind the Moon and lit its engine to slow down into orbit. This burn had to be precise. Too long, and they'd crash onto the lunar surface. Too short, and they'd sail past the Moon into deep space. Fortunately, everything worked as intended. Looking down at the surface, they saw an unending expanse of craters, from massive basins miles across to tiny holes the size of dinner plates. Determining scale was difficult. A large crater could look identical to a small one, just closer. They chose a landing spot in the Taurus-Littrow Valley, believed to offer unique geological secrets. Because of the low sun angle needed to highlight terrain features, the mission had to launch from Earth at night in December 1972. The LM Challenger separated from the command module. Then, at around 7,000 feet, they pitched over, glimpsing the towering mountains surrounding the narrow valley, peaks higher than those of the Grand Canyon. Cernan guided the LM down carefully. Stand by for touchdown. Contact. Shutdown. With that, they radioed, "Houston, Challenger has landed." Cernan later said that was the moment when the dream became reality. First footsteps and a dusty flag. Stepping off the LM onto the lunar surface, Cernan dedicated their landing to everyone who had made Apollo 17 possible. The U.S. flag, planted once more, appeared to wave in a non-existent breeze, merely a testament to how the fabric moved in lunar gravity. For him, it was one of the proudest moments of his life. Schmidt and Cernan had much to do. The mission's science plan included deploying an advanced ALSEP, Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, with new instruments, such as the complicated long-period gravimeter, designed to detect potential gravity waves. It never worked properly, though they spent substantial time trying to fix it. They drilled into the surface to gather core samples and measured the Moon's internal heat flow. For mobility, they used the Lunar Roving Vehicle, LRV, which let them drive many kilometers from the LM. Driving on the Moon posed its own challenges. Distances were deceptive, and the horizon was closer than on Earth because the Moon is much smaller. Nevertheless, they systematically visited geological sites around Taurus-Littrow. The astonishing orange soil. During their second EVA, or excursion, they made one of the Apollo program's most remarkable discoveries. Schmidt exclaimed, "Oh hey, there's orange soil here. Don't move it till I see it." Stirring the dust with his foot revealed an unexpected patch of brilliant orange soil, volcanic glass that offered unique insight into the Moon's volcanic past. This half-hour of sampling turned into one of the most scientifically productive spans of any lunar mission, accomplished even before Mission Control could advise them. While scientists were hoping to find the oldest rocks possible to map the moon's age and history, they were rewarded with this startling material from deep within the lunar crust, possibly 500 kilometers down, that gave clues about the moon's formation. Today, many believe this evidence supports the theory that the moon was captured by Earth, although opinions vary. Overcoming obstacles and a fender bender. No Apollo mission passed without hiccups. Cernan accidentally knocked off part of the rover's rear fender, showering them in dust whenever they drove. Lunar dust is a serious annoyance, fine enough to infiltrate suits, instruments, and electronics. Lacking the fender, they stirred up dust clouds that clung to everything. John Young, from Apollo 16, back in Houston, devised a makeshift solution using a geology map and 2 clamps, which Cernan and Schmidt then fashioned into a replacement fender. A grand finale. On their final EVA, they visited a massive boulder known as Station 6, a site that illustrated the staggering forces creating the moon's great basins. Schmidt remarked on camera, "This is a rock composed of many fragments, of many sizes and shapes." Cernan added a commemorative message. "We hope that when we return this rock, or some of the others like it, to Houston, we can share a piece of it with so many of the countries around the world. May it serve as a symbol that humankind can live in peace and harmony in the future." Cernan, thoughtful and articulate, proved the ideal person to be the last man on the moon, carefully expressing the broader meaning of Apollo to the world. Liftoff from Taurus Littrow. Before departing, Cernan and Schmidt unveiled a plaque on the LM leg, stating that these final explorers of December 1972 had completed the first exploration of the moon in the name of all humankind. When it was time to leave, only a single ascent engine would carry Challenger's top half back to orbit. It was a simple but vital design, one that had to work on its first try. Cernan joked with Schmidt, "Let's get this mother out of here." Moments before ignition, the LM's liftoff was filmed by a camera they had left on the lunar surface, capturing the ascent stage shooting upward against the stark black sky. Ron Evans, waiting in the Command Module America, performed the difficult job of rendezvous. Once they were docked, the exhausted astronauts transferred rock samples, hardware, and themselves back into the Command Module. Schmidt and Cernan dragged in clouds of dust. Evans teasingly complained that they were messing up his pristine spacecraft. Journey home next came Evans's solo EVA in deep space, retrieving film cassettes from cameras stored in the service module's sim bay. The command module was the only section returning to Earth, so the priceless photos needed to be brought inside by hand. After that final spacewalk, they jettisoned the service module and oriented the command module for re-entry. Returning to Earth required a carefully controlled trajectory. Approaching Earth at 25,000 mph, the heat shield endured intense friction at about 400,000 feet altitude. Their guidance system guided them through a skip re-entry, briefly dipping into the atmosphere, then bouncing out again, then down for final descent. Peak deceleration was around 7 Gs, pressing them firmly back into their seats. Eventually, parachutes deployed, and the spacecraft splashed down safely. After Apollo 17, over 450,000 people worked on Apollo at its peak, each believing their efforts were crucial. They gave long hours, day after day, because they sensed they were contributing to something historically important. For many, the space program represented America's greatest endeavor, especially during the troubling Vietnam era, the upheavals in civil rights, and other societal tensions. Apollo offered something positive on the news, capturing the world's imagination. Astronauts and engineers often reflect on how the technology from Apollo, especially in communications, computing, and medical instrumentation, dramatically changed everyday life. Some argue exploration should not be seen as ignoring earthly problems, but rather as a different way to grow, an evolution that yields profound knowledge about ourselves, our planet, and beyond. Humanity, if it avoids self-destruction, will inevitably expand its reach. While the first lunar missions were risk-laden and expensive, the next journeys should be safer, more cost-effective, and designed for longer stays on the moon or other celestial bodies, with an emphasis on learning to live off the land. Apollo has changed our perspective on Earth and revealed a first-order understanding of the moon as a small planet. It also revolutionized how we approach all subsequent space missions. The program was an exploration initiative that only human presence could fulfill, politically and scientifically. "We will not rest on our laurels of having gone to the moon," Gene Cernan often said. "We will lead all of humankind into the future, and I truly believe that is our destiny." Where are they now? Captain Gene Cernan, Apollo 17 commander. Soon after the mission, he left NASA and worked as a network news consultant on space issues. He then became a successful businessman in Houston, Texas. Captain Ron Evans, Command Module pilot. Evans stayed briefly at NASA, acting as backup Command Module pilot for the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. He left NASA in 1977 for a career in the private aerospace sector near Phoenix, Arizona. Sadly, he died of a heart attack at age 56 on April 6, 1990. Dr. Harrison Jack Schmitt, lunar module pilot. Schmitt also remained at NASA for a time, helping with Skylab experiments. He returned to his home state of New Mexico and entered politics, serving as a United States Senator in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Based in Albuquerque, he now consults for various corporations advancing the goal of colonizing the moon, particularly for mining helium-3, an abundant lunar resource that could someday power fusion reactors on Earth. Apollo 17, humanity's last voyage to the moon in the 20th century, signaled the end of an era of breathtaking progress, and yet it also laid the groundwork for our future in space, a future in which the scientific legacy of Apollo, the dreams of its crew, and the inspiration it gave to countless others remain as vivid as the orange soil Jack Schmitt first glimpsed on that distant lunar plain